Welcome to another episode of Free Thinkers Anonymous. If you're tuning in, we're continuing our segment talking about the visual effects industry. And now we're going to talk about how the visual effects industry is treated by the rest of the film industry. The only thing left was job security. Studios come and go,
Yeah.
and it's a very tumultuous industry.
hmm
Going into the specifics of all the studios, I don't think is really necessary. But
Yeah, I
just
don't think so. But it basically just comes down to like Rhythm and Hues is definitely one I want to talk about
a good one.
because it was such a iconic moment where they were winning an Oscar for Best VFX for Life of Pi while all of the artists, all of them at the studio were outside the awards picketing it because their studio had just gone under.
Mm-hmm.
Because all of the the changes that were made were not paid for. I mean, it was a scope creep. It was they said they were expecting one thing and then they wanted more, then they wanted more, then they wanted more, and they weren't going to pay unless they got more. So Rhythm and Hughes was in a bind, and by the end of that project, the studio was out of money. All of the money that they had saved up before that point was gone.
Wow.
So studio went under while they were being awarded best VFX for the year. And it was never mentioned. It was never mentioned at the Oscars that the studio that won best VFX went under and was picketing at that very moment. And a bunch of the actors from the Marvel movies were up there making jokes about how the only reason people watch Marvel movies is because they're in them, not because the VFX. Like they made a joke about how they didn't even need VFX. And it was in such bad taste considering what happened to Rhythm and Hughes that year. Like it was a rough year to be a VFX artist. But I mean, there's a lot. There's studios that have been bought by overseas companies. There's studios that have gone under because of scope creep. There's studios that have gone under because they're run by con artists. There's studios that have been bought out by major production companies. Quickly going through the transient nature of our industry, which kind of translate to job security. Like most of the major studios have moved in the past decade. I would say probably 80% of the large to medium sized studios have either completely moved or opened up new branches in other areas, whether that's India, China, Korea, uh, for overseas studios. Then we also have Toronto and Vancouver for people that have opened up in Canada because there's a lot of tax subsidies up there. Um, and then New York City, Austin, Atlanta for outside of the LA area, where LA used to be like the big hub. And now also San Francisco is another one. Every single one of those areas either pay almost nothing, like pretty much anything in Asia, or they pay about the same amount that you would make in LA, but they are even more expensive to live than LA, with the exception of Austin, which is slightly cheaper than LA, and Atlanta, that is notably cheaper than LA. If y'all can't figure out, that's where I live. It's about an hour outside of Atlanta, right? Because it's the only place to live that's close to the film industry that is not ridiculously expensive to live in. And already it's ridiculously expensive to live almost anywhere. But it's the the studios are moving to more expensive areas, but they're paying the same amount that they were paying before. And I would say maybe 10% of them are actually providing any kind of transfer packages where they pay for a portion of the cost for you to move to a different country just to stay with the company. Some do, most don't. Also, pretty much all the big studios are in right to work states, so they can fire you whenever they want for any reason whatsoever, and you can't sue them unless it's obvious or there's an indicator that it's because of a protected status like disability, gender, race, that type of thing. Projects can range from a day to a few years, but it's extremely rare to go for a few years unless you're in a leadership position. Most contracts are in the 3 to 4 month range. And at the end of that 3 to 4 months, you have to find new work. And at the right before that completely ends, you are working the craziest hours of the entire project. So you basically have to line up a project for after the project as soon as it starts. Because if you don't, then you're going to have some downtime once the project ends, which means you're not making money. So I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand with the transient nature of our industry is that if we're working for, say, a month, and then for the last 2 weeks of that, we're working like 80 hours. And then once that project ends, we start to look for more work. If we don't find work in the next 2 weeks, we might as well have not worked any overtime because we've lost all of the extra money we made by working those insane hours. But we also have the stress of finding another job. And I don't think people understand how relaxing it is to just be able to keep a job, not wondering whether or not you're going to have to move in a few months, or not wondering whether or not you're going to have any income in a few months. Yeah, we might be able to get unemployment, but there's generally a 2 week delay. You still pay taxes on it that aren't taken out. So you have to consider that when you're getting this money that you desperately need, you don't really get enough to survive on because most of these areas that the jobs are in cost way more than you can afford. And generally speaking, unemployment's like 40% of the money you would typically make. And you have to reapply after every individual contract. And it's based on your earnings from 6 months ago up until like 18 months ago. So if you're new in the industry, you have pretty much no fallback at all. So you are extremely vulnerable then. And if you don't find work in a certain amount of time, you can lose unemployment benefits as well. So there's a lot of reasons why unemployment is not the assistance that it seems like it is. And then also, as I mentioned, contract work means you don't get benefits, you don't get holidays, you don't get PTO. You're pretty much done with that studio at the end of that contract unless something else big comes up. You don't get overtime pay, even though you are expected to work about 50-hour weeks. If you're an employee, then you do get overtime pay and double pay if you work enough hours. Anything over 60 or over 12 in a single day. If you're working contracts, taxes aren't taken out. So you could be hit with tens of thousands of dollars that you owe the IRS at the end of the year if you're not careful about that. For employees, generally get paid usually just 2 weeks, like a typical job. For contract work, you're generally going to get either net 30 or net 60 agreements, which means that you get paid 30 to 60 days after you send an invoice for the work that you did. So, say you send an invoice in after every 2 weeks. So, you start the job, you work for 2 weeks, you send the invoice. You then have to wait 30 days after that before you actually get paid for the work you did for those 2 weeks. So, there's effectively a 6 week delay from the work you do to the work that you actually get paid for. And that can be a real hit when you're getting to the point where you don't have much money left and you're starting up a new job and you're like, okay, cool. Now I get to breathe a little bit. And then you don't get paid for 6 weeks. You're like, oh, no, I don't get to breathe. And then as soon as the money starts coming in, you're like, okay, now I can breathe. But that's when everything picks up at the studio. So now you're expected to work longer hours, so you can't breathe anymore. So it's kind of a continuous just streak of one stress over another. One of the other things with the transient nature of our industry, it is very common for long-term work to fall through at the very last minute or even after the last minute. I've had multiple projects, many projects, where I've been told that I'll start any day now and never hear back from them. I've had multiple projects where I've been told I start on Monday and then never hear back from them. I have multiple projects where I have signed the contract to begin work and it's disappeared. They were just like, hey, we don't need you anymore. I I have had more than one project where I have started work, funds have dried up, and I was told that I was going to be needed for continuing work, but halfway through post production, they were like, "Hey, um, we're done because we don't have any more funds. We'll let you know once we have funds to continue post production, and then we can actually release this project." And then I never hear back from them again. And I mean, some of these projects are like 7 years old at this point that have never seen the light of day, that are never going to see the light of day because they require probably $20,000 worth of post production to be put into them. And there's no funds to actually go into doing that post production. So there's a lot of money that you think you can count on that you can't. And that's assuming that you actually get paid for your work. And that's definitely something that happens in our industry, like having unpaid overtime, having unpaid work hours, not getting paid at all. There's definitely some fly by night studios that set up shop, they get a few projects, and then they pull on some newer artists. They have the artists do the work, they send the work out to the clients, they get paid for it, and then they close down shop and they never pay the artists for their work. It doesn't happen often, but it happens enough that it's worth bringing up. There's thankfully only one studio I've worked for. I've really had to fight to get them to pay me, and that took probably like 5 or 6 months to get them to pay me for one of the projects that I worked on. And they didn't pay me anything until that point. And they were super happy with the work that I did. But I made the mistake of sending them final files without having them pay first. So one thing I always suggest to newer artists is having a client pay half up front and then half upon delivery of final assets, because that way it guarantees them that you will stay onto the project and it guarantees that they will pay you what you need. So that's the transient nature of our industry. Again, a lot more nuance to that, but it's a good place to start. Mike, I'll hand it off to you. You get into the way that we're treated by the rest of the industry.
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, there's this famous phrase that's always been thrown around a lot, which is, well, just fix it in post, right? So there's always this perspective, and I've worked on a few productions like that. Yeah, where they kind of just went ahead, filmed everything, and they came to you and said, okay, we're expecting you to deliver on all these visual effects shots to problem solve everything that you should have been with us there on set to figure out, but we're going to leave it up to you, the visual effects artist, to kind of figure out how you're going to apply these visual effects to the shots. That's an experience that people have in, small productions where they hire one guy to handle all the visual effects for them, and to whether it be, someone was wandering around in the background, that we got to hire someone to remove that person in the background. Yeah, I worked on a project where the director was very go, go, go. So he was filming things constantly without something that you do normally on set, which is like, okay, we're about to film again. Everyone who doesn't need to be on set at the moment, leave, and we're going to start filming. The director just kept filming. So I worked with the guy who had to constantly digitally remove people in the background who didn't know they were filming. There's things like that happen. Going back to invisible visual effects, there'll be things that you take for granted, like there's going to be a camera in the reflection. You could maybe while you're recording dialogue, there's a boom mic that can be seen at the top of the screen. There's all these things that happen while filming that you don't realize need to be fixed. That's why we have that phrase, we're just going to fix it in post. So in some ways, things become a little, I don't know if I would say lazy, but maybe a little bit rushed, or things that are overlooked that people, when watching their dailies, which is what you do after a day of filming, you go back, see what you shot for the day, see what works, what doesn't, see what you got to go back and fix. And some things they would say, you know what? We're not going to fix that right now. Someone else can deal with that later on down the road. And unfortunately, if too much money is spent up front and there's only so much money left at the end, I mean, I was brought into a project one time where that's what happened. There was almost no money. The supervisor was paying us out of his own pocket to finish these shots, to get the work done, because they blew through all the budget during production. So, unfortunately, visual effects, which is a very important part of the filmmaking process, isn't always planned out for. And sometimes they're able to get additional funding to pay for things to be finished. But the amount of times that Jeremy and I I've seen this personally working on some projects where we have the finished visual effect shots. We made all the fixes, it's polished, it's clean, it looks amazing, but the client ran out of money. So they don't get those finished shots. And what you see on the big screen is something that looks unfinished. Everyone calls it out. We get a little upset that we're blamed for something that doesn't look great, but we finished the work.
Hmm.
Client ran out of money. So these are
Hmm.
things that happen in our industry we're fully aware of. And we're just as annoyed as much as the audience is when we see something that doesn't look good. And people turn to me and tell me, aren't you upset when you see something look bad on screen? And my response is, well, what was the time and what was the budget? Did they have enough
Yeah.
time to make something that looked great and incredible? Because as Jeremy mentioned earlier, all this stuff takes iterations. You're never going to get something that looks amazing the first time out. You have to go
Hmm.
back, make notes, improve it. And if you want something to look really good, I mean, I worked at a studio that did this. They do amazing work, but the client only paid them so much. So the artist said, okay. And that's the quality of work that they turned around and delivered. And I've seen them do much better work. The same artists do incredible job on the show, but that show had a bigger budget. So it had nothing to do with the talent involved. It had to do with how much the client was willing to pay for it.
Hmm.
And these are things that people just don't know about.
Yeah.
Is something done at the very end? Sometimes they're constantly changing things on us, like Jerry mentioned earlier. And we have
Hmm.
to accommodate for those changes. And we've seen this happen to studios multiple times where the client will come and tell them, hey, we don't care. Don't you know who we are? You're going to turn around and do these fixes for us for free.
Oh yeah. No, the big four definitely throw their weight around.
And that's something that we've seen. And, and part of the reason why we're having this conversation, Jeremy and I, is because we would have these conversations back when we were working at this big studio together, Well, not big in name, but big in size. I think there was like a
Yeah.
few hundred artists who worked at this facility. And
Hmm.
yeah,
And there were hundreds that worked at their outsourced one.
we would take notice of
Hmm.
how things went down. And it wasn't always the fault of the artist. It wasn't even always our fault either. It sometimes it was just came down to mismanagement. And this is the thing
Hmm.
that constantly comes up when it comes to visual effects studios, like Jeremy mentioned, Rhythm and Hues going under. That was because they kept coming to them, fix this, fix this, fix this. And it was like, okay, but you got to give us more money to make all these fixes, to make all these changes. And the director of Life of Pi, which Rhythm and Hughes was getting that award for when they went under, he made a very bold statement. It's right there in black and white in a news article where he said they should feel so lucky to do this for me. I forget where he's from, but the director, he said, back home, they'll be so grateful to work on my film. They would do this for me for free. And who are these artists to demand that they should have been paid what they were deserved to be paid?
Honestly, you say it's generally mismanagement. I would say it's always mismanagement. I don't
Mm,
think there's a single time there's a justified reason for having these insane overtime hours, having things change constantly late in the game. People need to put their foot down and say, no, this is what we agreed upon,
mm,
unless the financial gain is worth it. And that gets shared with all of the people involved. Because I know, like, I mean, for instance, when I did that 24-hour project, like, I got paid triple what I usually do because it was such a rush project and last minute. They knew I could help them out. They knew I could deliver in 24 hours, and it was going to be 24 hours of straight work. So they made sure that they compensated me for that work. If they weren't going to pay me that rush fee, I wasn't going to do it.
mm.
And I wish the VFX studios would start to do this, where they put down their foot and say, hey, no,
Right.
this is what we agreed to. What you're asking us to do now is not what we agreed to. So we're going to do what we agreed to. and you can pay us for that. Or if you don't want to hire us anymore, we can step off the project. But there's no studio that's even willing to make that bluff, even if it is a bluff. And it puts all studios in a position of subservience
Mm-hmm.
where they just have to beg for scraps. And they don't actually have to beg for scraps because there's so much work out there right now. Even right now, even with the strikes, even with the pandemic, there's still so much work out there that they could turn down work if they wanted to. I think the strikes have slowed down the work a fair amount, but still, the work itself is not as dire as it seems. It's the studios that aren't hiring because the work is so inconsistent and there's so many delays on when release dates are set up.
Mm-hmm.
If we can spend a full year working on this project that we typically only spend 3 months on, we can downsize our entire team. We don't have to pay for unemployment for all of these employees. We can just worry about paying for the people that we really need, like a core team, and get the same amount of work done, get the same quality of work done, and not do crazy overtime hours. And that's going to be more beneficial for us, even if it means taking a step back. I have a feeling that that's what a fair amount of the medium to large size studios are doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then the smaller studios, I think, are just begging for any kind of work. Once again, it's this constant state of subservience. And it's dangerous because, on top of that, is the begging for scraps where everybody's undercutting everybody else. And I know you didn't really want to get into the 3D conversion industry, but I think that's worth mentioning here because it's the perfect microcosm.
Mm-hmm.
But converting a minute of footage back when I first got into the industry, back in like 2010, was around $80,000 for 1 minute of footage. So you look at these hour and a half, 2 hour long films, that's a lot of money to spend on conversion. And that's why I always was of the opinion that native and converted stereo is probably best to integrate together. But nobody ever cared enough about 3D conversion for that to ever be a thing because of the underbidding and that there were so few competitors and there were so few clients because that's a lot of money to throw at a film to convert it into 3D if it doesn't mean significantly more than that back in added value for the film.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, it was Disney, it was Marvel. Well, actually, not even Disney because Disney does all of their stereo conversion in house. Well, not really conversion, more like stereo rendering in house, but like it's basically Marvel, Paramount, Universal. That's pretty much it. Like very rarely you would get another film that you would convert, but it was pretty much all one of those three. And then Star Wars. So like Lucasfilm, Marvel, Paramount, and Universal. Like those four were pretty much the only ones that would ever have a film converted. So when you only have four clients, you need to make sure that you keep at least one of those four clients happy because there were only four competitors too.
Mm-hmm.
So if each of those studios are only coming out with one, maybe two movies a year, there were definitely years that a lot more came out. But let's say they're only coming out with 1 to 2 movies a year that they want converted. Well, if you have one of the clients, then that means you're only getting 1 to 2 movies per year to convert. So you've always got to be thinking about that in the back of your head. Like, I need at least one of these clients to be guaranteed. Because say I have one client, well, maybe next year they're going to go with one of my competitors. Now I have zero clients unless I have a client from one of my other competitors. So, because of that, there was just constant underbidding to the point where a minute of conversion went from $80,000 in 2010 down to $17,000 By 2015, a 75% reduction in conversion cost in 5 years because of underbidding. It's insane the level of subservience that the visual effects industry has, because that same level of underbidding and subservience and begging for scraps happens in the visual effects industry as a whole. It's just so much easier to see in the microcosm of stereo conversion because it's so much simpler to pick apart.
The first gig I had, I worked at a small studio that did a lot of marketing. So
Mhm.
they worked a lot of commercials, a lot of ad space. And that whole gig, all I heard was underbidding. Here was me, a kid straight out of school, and they were saying, all right, Mike, you need to produce work that's competitive with someone who's got 8 years experience on you. I need you
Mhm.
to outperform what they can do. And it was to do photo real rendering and give me like a few weeks to crash course to improve my skills and to be competitive. And eventually we did win bids. So I was
Mhm.
able to get that work for him, but it was ridiculous. I was not sleeping,
Mhm.
working really hard because the whole company he put on my back, which that was messed up to do.
Oh yeah.
To say, like, I got millions on the line and I need you to pull this off for me. When I heard this opportunity to work at a conversion studio, I thought, well, stereo conversion sounds like it's the hot new thing. That's what everyone was talking about. The
Mhm.
first movie to really have that experience was the first Avatar film. That's part of what propelled into the stratosphere was the fact that when you went in, you put those glasses on, you were immersed in this world, in this environment.
Mhm.
So we thought, okay, this is going to be a big thing. We see all these major Marvel movies are coming out in 3D and all this stuff was happening. So when there was an opportunity to become a part of that, I was like, okay, cool. This is going to blow up. When you spoke about conversion earlier, you talk about how it can add to the storytelling element to really kind of create more atmosphere and more to really help emphasize and really help you kind of play with your senses a bit more than just watching flat image on a big screen. Um, so that was interesting, sure, but at the same time, it turned out to be like this huge fad. I had the perception of stereo conversion and watching 3D movies like that the way I do is just that it was something that was big because at some point they were able to capitalize and make a ton of money when you had these huge, flashy, over-the-top films. And now, if you go to a movie theater, the only time you really watch a movie where you put on the glasses is like a 4D theater where the seats move and they spray a little water mist at you and stuff. That's why a lot of that is still big in China and markets where they primarily push theaters to have 4D experiences because they want to really drive up the ticket price, almost like you're going into a ride that you would be at in like in Universal Studios or Disneyland. That's what they turn that film experience into. That's fine. Some people really like that, feel as if that adds more to their enjoyment of the film. But like you mentioned, always coming down to penny pinching. How do we increase our margins? How do we make more profit year to year? And when it turned into big studios saying, you know what, we understand that some people would want to say that there could be this artistic expression watching a stereoscopic film. We don't care. All we want is this stuff to pop out at you at certain moments and you go, ooh, and that's all that matters. When that became the focus, just to create that illusion of 3D, but not really add to the movie, just have that effect. That's when you see them really start to say, well, let's just outsource, let's bring down the price.
So for next time, things that we're going to be discussing, outsourcing, definitely, as far as the work being sent overseas and as far as the our jobs being sent overseas. So like our clients are sending work overseas, but also our studios are sending our individual roles at that studio overseas. The pandemic, shift to remote work, the strikes, how that's hit us, AI, how that is kind of changing up everything, and unionization, which started as a big report that Marvel's unionizing. Everybody was like, oh, that's great. It's unset people from Marvel that happen to be in the VFX side of things were unionizing. Less than 50 people were part of that union. It just said Marvel. So people thought it was a much bigger impact than it actually is. But since then, Other studios have started to unionize, and it's great news, but we'll get into that a little bit more later. So, Mike, I'll let you kind of close it out. And did you have any kind of final thoughts?
I think I do want to highlight the fact that Jeremy and I are looking at doing a very like fun like YouTube video. What is VFX? And to kind of go over with a more graphic animation, motion graphic directed towards create a better picture so that as we keep doing these segments, people can be like, oh, okay, cool, visual effects, that's fun, and probably do something in a way that a general person who may not have the knowledge of it and be like, okay, cool. I think I find that interesting. I think I want to tune in and see more of what these guys are actually talking about. And we'll probably also do something to, hey, if you're interested into game to VFX, this is what you should consider, this is what you do. Make it less doom and gloom and make it a little bit more, highlight the fact of like how we viewed it going into it, what, things that we wish we would have known going into visual effects, how to maintain yourself in the visual effects industry, equal work-life balance, because it's very easy for us to, some of us put on some weight, be in the industry. Some of us picked up some bad habits. Quick segment that'll be shorter. Highlight these are schools you should look at going to. These are things you should kind of consider. These are maybe programs or groups to be part of, with things unionizing. Sure that's going to evolve and adapt, especially if it becomes part of a thing of like, hey, join this union as you become part of visual effects. We're definitely going to keep an eye on how much that actually develops and how much that actually caters to the average visual effects artist. Because right now it's mainly these big major studios where they do kind of have sort of like staff people on board that are kept year round. So of course you want to incentivize those people to stay. Yeah, I think those are like the only things I want to highlight just to look at moving forward. Does Marvin have any insights? A few gems, if you will.
I mean, not really. I think Jeremy kind of covered a lot of that pretty good. He said there's a lot going on in the industry. Good that we're having these conversations just so people are more aware of how things are, especially if they're trying to get into it and where we kind of see things going. All good stuff. I enjoy listening to everyone giving their viewpoints.
And with that, I think we're just going to end it here. And thanks everybody for tuning in to another episode of Free Thinks Anonymous. Of course, I want to thank Jeremy and Marvin. And yeah, definitely tune in for the next one.